Welcome everyone to class lecture number 5, and I'm dealing with two large topics today: the imperfect indicative, a new verb tense, and a new type of verb called contract verbs. Last class we dealt with the present indicative. This class we're learning a new verb tense called the imperfect indicative, and it describes an action in the past that was not completed or perfected. We're also going to learn about a family of verbs called contract verbs. They are omega verbs whose stem vowel ends in an alpha, an epsilon, or an omicron. And when these vowels at the end of the stem combine with the connecting vowels of the personal endings, something called contraction happens. We'll learn a bit about that. So what's the meaning of the imperfect? The imperfect in the indicative indicates past action that is ongoing or in progress. For instance, I was eating dinner. This can be contrasted with the nuance of perfect action, and that is past action that is completed or finished. Or, for instance, I have eaten dinner. So we're going to start by talking about the imperfect tense form and its meaning. So the imperfect tense form conveys past time action and imperfect aspect. So last class we dealt with two kind of aspects of Greek verbs: the time of action and the kind of action. And these two things actually go together when talking about Greek verbs. So the kind of action is called verbal aspect, and it suggests in the imperfect tense action that is ongoing or in progress. So in the same way that in last class we learned about the present tense conveying action, at least in the indicative, in present time, its verbal aspect also dealt with ongoing action or continuing action or action that is in progress. The difference here is that imperfect has action that's in the past. Okay? So it's past action that is ongoing or in progress. Let me talk a little bit about some of the nuances of the imperfect that we're going to find in the New Testament. The first one is something called progressive imperfect. Okay? And it conveys an action in the past that's in progress. Here's an example from Mark chapter 12, verse 41. Kai polai, polus sion, ek balon, pola. Now the verb here is ek balon, not ekbalon, ebalon, which means to cast or to put into something. Okay, and this is an example of an imperfect verb. Right? So this is your verb. This is a conjunction kai. This is the subject, and this is the object. Okay, so subject and object. Okay. So, many rich people were putting in a lot of money, much money, okay? So, the idea here is that this is a progressive action. This was something that was happening all the time. It was a thing that was an action that was continuing, okay? So, progress. And the second one that happens from time to time, you got to watch for, is something called the inceptive imperfect. Inceptive means at the beginning. of an action, okay? And when we translate it into English, we usually use the word began or started with the verb. So here's an example from Mark 2. Kai pas ho oklos, erxeto pros auton, kai edidasken autus. Okay, so there are kind of two imperfects here. There are this one, which is a middle-only verb, but this is the one that is the inceptive imperfect, okay? And a large crowd, this is the subject, a large pas ha logos, oklos, came, they came is the verb, to him, and this is the verb for teaching, didasko, and it's in the imperfect, okay? You can see by the ending and the augment in front. And this is a personal pronoun meaning them. So the crowd came to Jesus, and what did Jesus do? He began to teach them. So we know from context that they're revealing kind of an action of the crowd coming to him. And as the crowd came to him, he began to teach them. And so there's an inceptive idea with this. And the third nuance that we find a lot with the imperfect in the New Testament is something called an iterative. And an iterative communicates a repeated or a customary action in the past, something that was done on a regular basis. Okay, so they kept on, they repeatedly, or they continually, almost, idea of habitually doing something. And here's an example from Acts 2:40. Heterois te logos pleosin die marturato kai parakale autus. And with many words, with many other words, he solemnly testified, and he kept on exhorting them. So this is the word for exhorting. So the augment goes here, and we see the imperfect ending. He kept on exhorting them. Okay? So this is talking about he continually, he repeatedly, he kept on exhorting the people. Okay? So, progressive, inceptive, and iterative. Kind of three major nuances of the imperfect tense in the Greek New Testament. I want to talk a bit about the imperfect tense and voice. And if you remember, voice deals with active voice, middle, and passive. Okay. So an important distinction needs to be made here. Verbs whose lexical forms end in omega can be active, middle, or passive. Okay. So the example I'm using here is luo. So luo, these are the active endings. So luo, when you see these endings on an omega verb, you know it's in the active voice. So eluon is first person singular, imperfect, indicative, active. But if you see this ending on it, eluamen, or these middle and passive endings, it can be middle or passive. Okay? That's an important distinction that we need to make. Again, the same distinctions hold as we saw in the present tense. Active endings and middle or passive endings. Okay? But if verbs have a lexical form that ends in omai, they are middle only. And the example here is puruomai, to go. Okay, I am going. Well, let's say this verb would occur in the imperfect tense. It will be middle endings in the imperfect, and the nuance is middle only. It's not passive, it's a middle only verb. Remember, middle only verbs are verbs who have middle endings, and they occur only in the middle voice. And the middle voice has the nuance of active meaning. Okay, it's translated as active meaning. I am going, I was going, elu e peru a main. Okay, and those are the middle endings that we see there. Okay, I want to walk through the paradigms of the imperfect indicative. So let's begin with using luo. So this is luo, our paradigm verb, which is to loose or to destroy. It's convenient because it's short. We don't have a lot of letters to write out or to sound out. So let's walk through. First singular is eluan. Second singular is eluez. Third singular is elue with a movable nu. Okay. The first plural is eluamen. The second plural is elueta, and the third plural is eluon. Okay. Now you'll notice a few things here. The presence of this epsilon at the front of the verb. This is called the augment. So verbs that begin with a consonant simply have an epsilon put on the front, and that's the marker of the past tense in the Greek New Testament. It's called the augment. Okay, and you'll notice a new set of endings. Okay, that are on the verb, but these are the same as we saw with the present tense. You'll also notice that the first person singular and the third plural look exactly the same. And only context will help us to discern the difference between the two if we see them within the Greek text. And here's the translation. So, eluan, I was loosing. So that idea of progressive past tense action. Here's the imperfect middle and passive. Okay. A first person singular, eluamen. Second singular, elu. Third singular, elueto. First plural, eluamatha. Second plural, eluesta. Third plural, eluonto. Okay? Again, a new set of meaning, a new set of endings that you need to learn. And remember, these are middle and passive. Okay, so what I've done here is I've given you the middle, the passive translation of these verbs. If you want to hear the middle or see the middle nuances, you'll see them within the textbook. So, eluamen, I was being loosed. So the idea of past action, passive action. I was being loosed. So I was tied up and I was being untied. I was being loosed by someone else. Okay? Let me talk about the components of the imperfect. Big word for that is morphology. So what are the components that we're seeing so far of luo? We're seeing this thing called the augment, which for, again, this verb that begins with a consonant is an epsilon. Okay? We're seeing a connecting vowel, just like what we saw with the present tense. And then the personal ending for the first person singular is a nu. So eluon. Those are the components. Augment, connecting vowel, and personal ending. This is true for all of the forms. Okay? Let's walk through them. We'll walk through them, the component parts later on, but I want to talk a little bit more about the augment, because that's an important point that we've got to note. Okay? So the augment, as I said earlier, is a prefix that's placed on the imperfect tense. and indicates that the verb's time of action is in the past. If the verb begins with a consonant, the augment is an epsilon placed at the front. If a verb begins with a single vowel, it will be lengthened to form the augment. So if you have a verb that begins with an alpha, it will lengthen to an eta. If you have a verb that begins with an epsilon, it will lengthen to an eta. If you have a verb that begins with an omicron, it will lengthen to an omega. So, for instance, akuo, I hear, will be lengthened to akuon. Okay, notice that the alpha lengthens to an eta. That's what happens with those vowel beginning verbs. So that's how the augment shows up. What happens if you have a diphthong? The first vowel of the diphthong lengthens. So the verb eucharisteo, which means I give thanks, that epsilon is lengthened to an eta. The second vowel, the upsilon, maintains its form. So eucharistun. Okay, this ending is different because we find out later it's a contract verb. We'll get to that later on in the class. If the verb begins with the diphthong and there's an iota as the second letter, the first letter will be lengthened, but the iota is going to subscript. So this is I to my. Okay, what's happening here? The alpha is lengthened to an eta, and that little iota subscripts. Okay, so this makes it tricky for us when we are parsing, because we have to kind of go backwards. If it begins with a consonant, we just are aware of the epsilon, but if it begins with a vowel or a diphthong, we almost have to unlengthen to get back to its lexical form to figure it out. And with this iota subscript, it makes it even more tricky, because we'll be looking through our dictionaries for a verb that begins with an alpha or an epsilon, and you have a tau as the next one. And that's going to be tricky for us, but we just have to be aware of that. Now, verbs that begin with an eta, iota, or an upsilon, or an omega normally leave the beginning vowel unchanged when the augment is added. So, for instance, iskuo, I am strong. Notice that it moves to having that imperfect ending, but there's nothing happening at the front. There's no augment. So be aware that these types of verbs don't lengthen their forms. And that makes sense, because you can't lengthen the eta because it's already long. You can't lengthen the omega because it's already long. And iota and upsilon are already long. So there are long vowels which really can't be lengthened. Okay. Let's look a bit at the morphology in detail. So again, eluon, augment, luo, connecting vowel, and the ending is new. Eluez, same thing. Augment, verb stem, connecting vowel is an epsilon and a sigma. Okay. Elue, augment, stem, connecting vowel, and we have a new here as the personal ending, but it's a movable new. Okay, so almost think of this as probably more accurately a zero ending here, a no ending, and the new is a movable new. First plural, you have an epsilon, the verb stem, an omicron, and the men ending. Augment, verb, stem, epsilon connecting vowel, and a tau epsilon. And then finally, the same as the first singular, epsilon, verb stem, omicron connecting vowel, and a nu on the end. as the personal ending. Eluan, eluez, elue, eluamen, elueta, eluan. Okay, you got to memorize those forms. Okay, let's deal with the middle and the passive, because there's an interesting development that we're going to see here. So it's pretty straightforward. Eluamen, augment, verb stem, connecting vowel, and main. The second singular is a bit tricky. Augment, verb stem. The connecting vowel is an epsilon. The real personal ending is su. So let's walk through it. Lu, so. That's what it looks like. But there's a little funny thing in Greek where the sigma does not like to be in between two vowels. So the sigma goes away, it drops out. So you have lu, o. And what we're going to find out later on is when two vowels come together, they often collide and form something new. So what happened here is you have the combination of an epsilon and an omicron, and it becomes lu, u. That's how we get to here. Okay. All right. But everything else is pretty straightforward. Next, I want to talk about the negative particle u, the word for not. Okay. How does it function within the Greek? U is a little particle that's used to negate an indicative verb. So what you will see is the u will go in front of a verb. So u lue, he is not loosing. Okay. This u is a particle. It's not like a noun. It doesn't change its form in terms of case or function, but it will change its form in accordance with the next word that comes up. And this is merely for pronunciation reasons. So if you have a vowel right after the particle, it will add a kappa on the end. This is to create a clear break. So up here we had lu, u, lue. So u, you stopped, start a new sound, lue. Okay? What if you had a vowel? It would be easy to let that u slide into the next vowel. So you need a stop. So uk, eluen. Uk, eluen. So a clear stop. Okay? Forces you to take a breath and stop. He was not loosing. So that's if you have a verb with, or a word with smooth breathing. Let's say you have a verb that right after the u that has rough breathing. Well, then the form shifts to an uk, an even harder stop. Okay, not just uk, but uk. So uk, hoop ago. Uk, hoop ago. I am not departing. So notice, okay, a clear stop, an upsilon with a rough breathing, and it goes uk, hoop ago. Okay. Now there's a form of u that's used to emphasize negation called uki. Uki. Okay, uki. It means no, it's emphatic. And there's another particle for negation, and that's may. And that's used in non-indicative verbal forms. So far we're learning indicatives. Next term, we're going to learn about non-indicative verb forms, like participles, infinitives, imperatives, subjunctives, and operatives. And that uses may as a form of negation. Okay? That's just for FYI information for you. Oftentimes in Greek you'll see in the text rhetorical questions. That is, rhetorical questions where the answer is assumed. It's not like the writer's searching for an answer, he knows the answer already. So when you use negation in asking a question in Greek, there's two different kind of nuances happening. So if the writer expects a positive answer, ou is used. And here's a good example. Uk hutos estin ha tekton. This is a question that was asked by the kind of unbelieving people in Nazareth. Is this not the carpenter? They're talking about Jesus. Is this not the carpenter? Well, a positive answer. Yes, of course. He's the carpenter. We knew him. He grew up here. Okay, is this not the carpenter? Yes, he certainly is the carpenter. But if you expect a negative answer, may is used. So this is Paul's discussion of tongues in 1 Corinthians 12, and he's asking a rhetorical question. Me, Pontus, glossis, la lucin. And that's a question. Okay, we can see that here. That's a question too, right? The question marker. Not all speak glossa in tongues, do they? And of course the answer is no, of course not. Not everyone speaks in tongues, because that's not a gift that is, in a sense, universal for all Christians. Some people get it, some people don't. That's the point that Paul is trying to make there. The last bit from this first chapter on imperfect is about something called irregular masculine nouns. So far we've learned about first and second declension nouns. First declension nouns, feminine nouns that end in alpha or eta. Second declension nouns, masculine and neuter nouns whose stem ends in omicron. But there are a kind of subfamily of nouns that end in an eta sigma. So mathetes and prophetes, disciple and prophet, and they are first declension nouns. Okay, so they're in this category, but they are masculine. So you get some masculine nouns that actually are first declension. Okay, and they are masculine in gender even though they have feminine forms. Now, that's true except for the nominative and the genitive singular forms. So, for instance, mathetes has that sigma on the end, which was the indicator of second declension, and its genitive singular form is mathetu. So it goes to a kind of a more of a second declension ending in its nominative and genitive forms, but everywhere else it's like this first declension pattern. Now they're masculine, so that means they take the masculine article, and if there's an adjective that is modifying this, and we'll learn about adjectives later, like let's say for instance the good disciple, the ha kalos mathetes, its adjective will be masculine in form. Okay, so here's a paradigm of disciple, and we can see that already. So the sigma here, the omicron, upsilon there, but everywhere else it looks like a feminine noun. Next part of this lecture is dealing with something called contract verbs, and they are not verbs that are used when you're making a contract. They are verbs who have a vowel at the end of their stem, and these vowels contract. That's why they're called contract verbs. Okay, now they aren't any different in meaning from regular omica verbs. What makes them different are these contract vowels, which create different combinations at the end when you put on the endings, and therefore we need a special attention paid to them. So a contract verb is a verb whose verb stem ends in an alpha, an epsilon, or an omicron. Here are some examples. agapao, there's an alpha. Poieo, I do or I make. Plerao, I fulfill. And as I said earlier, contract verbs require special treatment because their stem vowels contract with the connecting vowels of the personal endings. And this makes things a bit tricky for us. So let me just define my terms a bit. Contraction means that these contract verbs frequently have letters drop out or combine with the personal endings added to them. And we're going to see visible signs of contraction and change happen in these endings. But the good news is the primary tenses affected are the present and the imperfect. In the other verb tenses we're going to learn, there's usually a letter that appears between the verb stem and the ending that acts as kind of a buffer zone for these contract verbs. So we don't have to worry too much about them after these initial two verb tenses. So I want to talk about what kind of real form versus lexical form. So lexical form is what you find in the dictionary. So if you were to look up these verbs in a dictionary, you would find a certain form. Okay, poieo, agapao, plerao, which is always the first person singular, present, indicative, active. That's the lexical form for all verbs, okay? Except if you have, say, a middle only, okay? And this is the lexical form of contract verbs, what you find in the dictionary. However, these forms with the contract vowel intact really aren't the real inflected form for the first person singular. What we see is poio, agapo, plero. Okay? So why do we stick this little vowel in here? Well, it indicates that first of all, it's a contract verb. Okay? So once you know it's a contract verb, you can predict and recognize the inflected forms. You're aware that it is a contract verb. Okay, so that's the difference between the lexical form and the real inflected form of these contract verbs. And that's an important point to make. Okay, these lexical forms do not happen in real life. Okay, they are artificial. Okay, they're there for our knowledge alone. Here's a little chart of contraction, and you can see what happens. So when you have an alpha and an alpha, one alpha drops out and you just get an alpha. When you have an alpha and an epsilon colliding, the alpha is predominant and it pushes the epsilon out of the way. So that chart's helpful, and you'll find a similar chart in your textbook. But the authors of the textbook really emphasize that the rules of contraction are a much better way of understanding vowel contraction. And these rules of contraction are taken from another Greek grammarian called Bill Mounce. So here's 5 rules that you can memorize. Contract vowel plus singular vowel. So let's say you have a contract vowel combining with a singular vowel of an ending. So what we see here is the final product of an oo, and to get there you have an epsilon or an omicron or an epsilon, or 2 omicrons combining. Okay, so these vowel combinations result in an oo. Rule number 2, if you have 2 epsilons combining, you will get an epsilon iota. Rule number 3, if you have an omicron or an omega combined with almost any vowel, you're going to get an omega, except for the cases in rule number 1. So these combos of omicron and epsilon. Okay. Rule number 4, an alpha plus an epsilon results in an alpha. Rule number 5, an omicron plus an epsilon iota results in an oi, okay? So again, it's almost like this omicron epsilon combines to an oi, and you get the iota on the end, okay? So this is when you encounter singular vowels. Let's say you can encounter a diphthong. If the contract vowel and the first vowel of the diphthong are the same, they simplify. Okay, that is, the double letter drops out. So let's say you have an epsilon and this is the diphthong. That epsilon drops and you get epsilon iota. Let's say you get an omicron plus an omicron oo. That omicron drops out and you just get the oo. So that's the first rule. If the contract vowel and the first vowel of the diphthong are different, they contract. So what happens here? You get the alpha and the epsilon moving to an alpha. So going back to the singular rule, and the iota subscripts, okay, if possible. If it's an upsilon, it drops out. So epsilon plus omicron forms an oo, okay, which we saw on the previous page. And this upsilon left over simply drops out and you get the oo, okay? So this is a paradigm of the present indicative active for alpha, epsilon, and omicron contract verbs. So this is the middle, and remember the middle, again, what you're seeing here is middle endings placed on the end of the verbs. So contraction is happening with these middle endings as well. And here's the imperfect. The imperfect, again, what you're seeing is an augment at the front. So those are the active of the imperfect. These are the middle and the passive of the imperfect. Okay? And we learned about me, which means I am. It has an imperfect form, I was. Okay, and here's the imperfect form. Amain, ace, ain. Two forms in the first plural. Amen and ametha. Eta and of asa. And so this is the one that you need to be aware of. Okay, so here's an example of a me from John chapter 1. En arche, ein halagos, kai halagos ein proston theon, kai theos ein halagos. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Finally, I want to end by talking about alternative forms of the direct object. Okay, now we've learned that the typical direct object is in the accusative case. So, ton, for instance, ton logon, tain cardian. This would be the typical form of a direct object of a verb. However, there are some instances with some verbs where the direct object is going to be a different case. So for instance, sometimes you're going to see them in the genitive or the dative case. And these are instances where the helping phrases with the genitive of and with the dative case 2 or 4 are not used in the translation. They're just treated as direct objects. Okay? So verbs that take their direct objects in the genitive case akuo, arko, krateo, plerao. Okay? And then verbs that take their direct objects in the dative case. Akulutheo, apokrinomai, pistuo, proskuneo. Okay, that's everything for this lecture. So remember, the big items that we dealt with were the imperfect tense and contract verbs. And plus we dealt with some other stuff. So I encourage you to look back at the textbook and at the handout that I provided for the details on this. Okay?